looks like people are finally finished trickling in, but and we'll still have more people coming in. But we wanted to get started so you're not here all night, especially our representatives here who are traveling quite a distance. And some are actually going back home tonight. I'm really surprised, but good for you. All right, so I'm Cindy Rivera. I'm the chair of the New Canaan High School Guidance Department, school counselors, and we really welcome you here. We have not done a live panel since 2018, so it's been a while that we've done this. That funny thing called COVID got in between a lot of our events. So tonight, many of you sent in questions, and I've incorporated them into some of the questions I'm going to ask the panel, and we're going to, and so we will go through that. There hopefully will be some time for questions at the end, but the idea is to be out of here no later than 9 o'clock. So if you're coming up here for questions afterwards, be aware that these poor people have a ways to go. So first for some introductions. Who do I have next to me? Okay, I'm not going to start with you. I'm going to start at the other end. Mr. Paul Sund is here from Dartmouth. He joined the admissions staff at Dartmouth in 2000, became director of admissions in 2012. Prior to his work at Dartmouth, he had various admissions roles at Columbia and Vassar. Paul has also served as an advisor to College Board and to the Common App. You juniors and seniors should know all about that stuff. His professional presentations include sessions at annual meetings, our National Association of College and Admissions Counselors, National Association of Independent Schools, and New England Association of College Admissions Counselors, and has done a number of workshops on selective admissions for secondary schools. Paul holds an AB from Vassar and an MBA from Columbia. Next, we have Moses Murphy, who was named the University of Vermont's Director of Undergraduate Admissions in May 2021. In his role, Moses leads a staff of 42 admissions professionals who are responsible for outreach, recruitment, admissions, enrollment of undergraduate first-year transfer and international students. Small job, not much. He's worked in undergraduate admissions at U Vermont for 19 years, most recently as Senior Associate Director of Enrollment Operations. He's held various roles throughout the office, including in events, recruitment, technical implementation. Moses is also a member of our National Association and our New England Association. And College Board, New England Regional Council, and Association of Chief Admissions Officers of Public Universities. Of course, University of Vermont is the flagship of Vermont. So, and then next we have Dr. Patricia Peak, Dean of Admissions, Associate VP for Fordham, has been with the university in professional capacity since 1998. You don't look like that. Patricia is actively involved in the admissions profession. She's been the chair of the College Board's Middle States Regional Council, co-chair of New York State Association of College Admissions Counseling, Summer Institute for New Admission and College Counseling Professionals, as well as professional development and media marketing and technology committees of the association. Also a member of our national associations, and she was named a recipient of the New York NYSECAC Distinguished Service Award. She holds a doctorate in English literature and is a 3-time Fordham graduate. And finally, we have Gil Villanueva, Vice President for Enrollment and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Rhodes College in Memphis. Gil has been with us at a number of colleges over the years. We've kind of grown together. For 3 decades, Gil has served highly selective colleges and universities across the nation. Prior to his appointment at Rhodes, he was Associate Vice President and Dean of Admissions at the University of Richmond and Dean of Admission at Brandeis. He also worked at Bucknell and Harvey Mudd. Gil earned his BA in psychology at Pitzer, master's degree in higher education at Bucknell. He, too, has been in a number of national associations, served as a board member as well as president and chair of the Common App. For the College Board, he served on the Guidance and Admissions Assembly Council, was past chair and secretary for Southern Regional Council, and was a member of Task Force on Admissions in the 21st Century. There's a lot more around here, Gil. I'm not reading it all, okay? You've done a lot. So that is our panel tonight. We like to have people who can really give us a really wide perspective on college admissions. And so we're going to start the night first talking to you and letting you know there are 10th, 11th, and 12th grade parents and students here. And so they're at every stage of the process. This year we're helping our sophomores to start thinking about career interests and what that means for majors. Initial college searches. Our juniors are beginning to actively look at colleges and decide on the kinds of campuses that may appeal to them. And the majority of our seniors have submitted early applications and are still working on the rest. Each of you is a different size. You're in a different location. You have a different program. You have different programs of study. Let's start with talking about that, the differences between each of your campuses and why that may be important in the student searches. I'd like you to each speak to the advantage of the kind of campus you have, whether it's large school or smaller school, public versus private, religious affiliation, and what are the advantages of each of those. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak for a minute or so on that. Paul, do you want to start?
Do you want me to start? Okay, sure, yeah. I was really looking forward to hearing what you guys were going to say. So good evening again. I'm Paul Sunday, here from Dartmouth College. And just kind of thinking about maybe the quick thumbnail is that I would say about Dartmouth is massive resources, not many students, most of them undergrads, and located in a small kind of what I think of as the quintessential New England college town. And I can see advantages to this, and in my mind, it's really about you and the students and what's the best fit for you. And particularly for the 10th and 11th graders, as you wander into this, I think it's a good way to start because we do represent different kinds of institutions. And in our circumstance, the marrying of a leading research university, because we call ourselves Dartmouth College, but we have kind of the oldest business MBA program in the country, one of the oldest med schools in the country, and some other graduate programs, all small, but we're dominated by the undergraduate population. And for us, this is a really nice balance in terms of what it affords, resources flowing to the undergrads. So that's one aspect of things. I think that's advantageous. But that might not be right for you as you think about what the right environment is for you. And then we're in this small northern New England town, which I think is beautiful. I think it lends itself to reflection and a sense of the wider world. You're stressed about that chemistry exam, and then there's snow this morning, and you go, wow, there's something beyond that chemistry exam in my life, and isn't that great? So I think the setting has a profound impact on students' experience, and from my perspective, to the good. And the last point about this is the combination of the resources and the small town setting and the scale of the place. I think it fosters community, where students are investing in relationships with one another, and people are developing a very strong sense of connection, not just with their classmates, but with others within their community. And this strong connection between the alumni and their engagement in this place helps to fuel that sense of community among the students. So those are a few things I would just quickly point to that I see as advantages. And I think that greater question, right, is what kind of setting do you want to be in? And I'm really psyched when I think about your environments and how different those will be for students.
Go right down the line.
Yeah. So, yeah, Paul, when you're on the end, you never know if you're going to go first or last. I always like being kind of in the middle for that very reason.
Good planning.
So, again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Moses Murphy, Director of Admissions at the University of Vermont. And I, too, would kind of look at this through the lens of what is right for students. And for those students who choose UVM, what are some of the reasons that they point to in that decision-making process? As was mentioned, University of Vermont is the public flagship land-grant university for the state of Vermont. I guess that is my representation on this panel is as the representative of a public institution. I also represent what would be the largest institution information on the panel. So UVM has about 11,000 undergraduates. Really is considered a mid-sized institution, and really by the standard of public flagship universities is really quite small when you think of some of the flagship universities that are out there. And like Dartmouth, I think a real focus on undergraduate education. Our graduate school is very small, the university is made up of 7 schools or colleges. So when students apply to the University of Vermont, they don't apply generally. They apply to one of those specific schools and colleges. And I think for students who choose UVM, that size is something that they find attractive. Again, large enough where you have 100 different majors, a lot of resources, research opportunities, support systems, networking opportunities. But it isn't so large where you feel like you're lost in a sea of people. The average class size is only 30. I think the other thing that students always point to is the location. University of Vermont, if you don't know, is located in Burlington, Vermont, which is the largest city in the state. It is not New York City, certainly, but it is a great college town. A ton of stuff going on the shores of Lake Champlain. I like to call it the west coast of New England. It's sort of a funky college town with a lot of stuff going on where you can be downtown enjoying the arts or leisure or theater and music, but at the same time can travel 30 minutes and be on the ski slopes or hiking Camel's Hump or what have you. A real focus on research. National Science Foundation ranked us a top 100 public research university, secured more than $230 million in research funding last year. And I think something unique about UVM is in the center of our main campus, we have our medical college and level 1 trauma hospital. So our students are really able to engage in research with medical school faculty and with the hospital, and really have the opportunity to engage those faculty. Because again, with that focus on undergraduate education, we're really reliant on our undergraduates to help us with all those research opportunities that are available. So that's a little bit about UVM, and I'm happy to turn it over.
Thanks. Again, Patricia Peak, Fordham University. So New York was definitely the spoiler alert, so definitely a different environment, but it's what makes us unique. So we are the only Jesuit university in New York City, and you get the combined elements of being in an international city, but also have all the elements of Jesuit and Ignatian education, which is care for the whole person, the idea of really developing each individual as a person in the humanistic tradition. So average class size is 23, student-teacher ratio is 14:1, a commitment to undergraduate research, but all in this amazing city. And it draws a very diverse student population. So in the most recent incoming class, 48% of our students were domestic students of color, 7.6% were international students from more than 50 countries around the world, and typically we have about between 45 to almost 50 North Dakota and South Dakota, they mess us up every year, states in our class. So students get to interact with local students, particularly from the Mid-Atlantic region, but then go to class with students from all around the world in this setting in New York City. And then we take advantage of that. So we have a beautiful 85-acre green and Gothic campus in the Bronx, or we have the urban 8-acre campus in the heart of Manhattan. So students can choose the two environments, but both of them allow them experiential learning. So our students choose among 3,500 internships in the city, whether it be a business internship at PricewaterhouseCoopers or working at Sotheby's in art history. So our liberal arts and our business students have a little bit of everything when they come to Fordham. And then to couple with that, being in New York, it allows students to jump off into study abroad around the world quite easily, right? So you all know we can all fly pretty much anywhere direct from here. We have more than 100 study abroad sites, but our signature sites are our program in London, in Clerkenwell, which is an amazing program for both our business and our liberal arts students. And also, I always like to promote our program in Granada, Spain, because our students can spend time both in Spanish culture. They spend 2 weeks in Morocco. So it's just another one of those signature programs that allows for different opportunities. So in Jesuit education, there's a lot about discernment, reflection, understanding who you are as an individual, but also being a global citizen. So that's what makes Fordham unique. Gil?
Well, I also have to say you have Arthur Avenue, so,
Yes.
and Italian food.
So cannolis and pizza.
Yum. So, my name is Gil Villanueva once again, and I work at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm representing a lot of national liberal arts colleges in the country. And generally speaking, what you're going to find at a liberal arts institution is a situation where everything is for and about you, the undergraduate. Typically, not a lot of graduate students. When faculty are looking to do research, when they're looking for students to work with, it's going to be with you. Generally speaking, it's going to be really small classrooms. We often talk about, well, if you're not in your usual seat, someone's going to miss you, right? So this is the kind of thing that you might want to think about when you're looking at colleges and universities, particularly those who are sophomores and juniors at this time. So Rhodes College is one of the few national liberal arts colleges located in a major city. In fact, I counted for all of you. There's about 26 of us in varying, selectivity and so on and size. But Rhodes is about 2,000 students. So it's very, very small. It's an average class size of 13. And it's one of those things where you're learning so many cool things in the classroom, but your laboratory is in the city, with Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 1000 companies, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, there's professional sports teams. So you have to try really hard not to have an internship or some kind of experiential learning opportunity by the time you graduate from Rhodes. The one thing that sets Rhodes apart from other national liberal arts colleges is the fact that we actually have a lot of majors. Most typically have 45, maybe 50 at most. We have over 70 majors and minors at the college. So we feel that we offer certain things that you might also find at a larger school, such as business, for instance. The STEM field is very strong. We have pre-engineering. And of course, one of the things that I think sometimes is lost is the idea that if you're interested in competitive athletics, but not necessarily Division I, there's a lot of Division III schools out there, such as Rhodes, that compete at a pretty high level nationally also. So with that, by the way, that's where Elvis, is from, in case you're wondering. Really good barbecue.
I was wondering when the barbecue was coming.
Oh,
He's mentioned it 3 times tonight. I know it's good.
come to Memphis. We'll clog your arteries.
So often, in talking with families and students, they're always wondering very much why you do take one student but not another, and how you're building a class is, and seeing it from, I'd really like to talk about seeing it from the other side. What do you consider when you build a class? There are a number of things, that institutions have, that they have a number of buckets they have to fill. So if you could talk a little bit about what that's like for you, of what those buckets are that you might have to fill, or institutional imperatives that come into building a class that is not just about the perfect student from New Canaan High School. And who wants to start with that one?
I'll just jump in. So this is my 33rd year doing this work, and I'm lucky and fortunate to be doing it. And I learned from colleagues and really teachers who often talked about how we're in a position to build an orchestra each and every year. And we can't have an orchestra if everyone plays the violin, right? And we owe it to our students to make sure that our student body is reflective of a global society, because the world is this small now. And we also work for faculty, and faculty are interested in teaching different types of students. And this is why for even a small school like ours, 48 states are represented and over 63 countries are represented. So you hear a lot of things about institutional priorities, the things that we're looking for. I worked at an institution one time whereby, when I was a young dean at Brandeis, we wanted to diversify the student body. And if you were Muslim, Catholic, or let's say you're non-Jewish, it was one of those things that, well, it's a good thing because we're looking to diversify in that regard also. Working at a math and science place where we did not have enough women looking into engineering, for instance. And if you're a female engineer looking into our school back then when I was working at MUD, well, that was a good thing too. So again, one of those things that you might want to look into at the websites, check out the mission statements for these schools. It gives you a little hint. And also the strategic plan from school to school might give you an idea of the things that we're looking for. I'll begin with that.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
I really appreciate Gil's point about mission statements. I think that's super important. And I think to understand that admissions offices are creatures of their institutions, and it is their job to draw in a student body that will further the institution's ability to fulfill its mission. Like that's foundationally, that's what we're all doing. And so if you understand the mission statement of one school versus another, I think that's going to tell you something about the admissions process. And Gil's point about institutional priorities, I think, is really important. And I view that as their kind of macro, meso, and micro priorities. And I think the micro is the real challenge. And so Gil's point about institutional mission, right? There's the DNA of our institution. And so those are kind of the most macro. Kind of why are we here and what are we trying to do in the world, and that's very transparent in the sense, but it's also incredibly broad, and then there are these meso priorities. And so when Gil's talking about like doing your research, at Dartmouth, for example, we have opened an energy institute on campus, and it's all about the future of energy, and that building is kind of a meso priority. So as opposed to centuries-long priority, this is decades-long. So new building, new programming, hiring faculty, interested in students who are going to occupy that building, right? And so when you see those programs that are developing on a given school's campus, that can tell you something about where the institution is going. And is that a fit for your interests? And then the micro priorities, that's the toughest one. That's the one where when you ask us, so what are you looking for? In the back of our brains, we're thinking to ourselves, I don't know. And I don't know because each year my institution is going to come to my office and say, this is what we're interested in this year. And it might be the Russian professor and kind of saying, we need more students who are studying Russian. Or to use your orchestra analogy, I mean, yes, that's there, right? Who's the piccolo player this year? And those kinds of micro and very temporal priorities are going to hit our offices every year, and we're going to need to respond to that. And so the lens through which we're looking is how are you going to help us fulfill those priorities? So that's one aspect of fit. But then it just builds up from there, right? How are you going to help us fulfill our mission? How are you going to enhance the learning experience of our of your peers when you're on campus? Like we're thinking not just what are you going to learn, but what are you going to teach when you're on campus? And so fit itself is this multi-layered concept. And I think an important takeaway and another aspect of I don't know is because I don't know who else is in the pool. And I'm working to build community with different students from different places, serving different institutional priorities every year. And so it is a complex and unknowable until we really get into it and are reading the pool, and we can sort of say, oh, I can see how that student and this student and how this group will work really well together.
And it's not something you publish very often.
Yeah, right.
So it's not something that we as counselors can say,
Right.
oh, we heard Dartmouth needs a piccolo player.
Right. Well, that's the thing is the macro and the meso, totally, it's out there. Like we are
Yeah.
trumpeting that energy institute. Let me tell you, we're promoting that. But the micro,
Right.
no, and that's moving too fast.
And so that goes into doing your research and understanding a school beyond reputation and scores, and that's what we're going to move to next. Did any of you want to speak? Okay, so let's talk about that, because we are, you know, so the rise in applications that we're seeing per student, there's no way kids are looking at schools to that level when they're doing that, and it's so important in terms of finding that fit. So let's just start with the visit. When a student goes on campus, what should they be looking for in a campus tour? How do they even start to decide what school is the right one for them? And, you know, what kinds of factors should they be looking for? And are college visits even important anymore for you?
I'll jump in on that. So lots of negatives about COVID. One really solid positive was it forced us as universities and colleges to invest more in the virtual space and provide more access and ease of getting to know who we are without making that commitment of going, you know, 4 or 5 states or giving up a vacation because you needed to make that campus visit. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to really just start there to narrow that list down. And you can get mission from a lot of our virtual tours and information sessions. You can get a real good sense of who we are. Many of us even have students involved in those sessions. So you could start to really get your list narrowed down. There is immense value in making them the personal visit to the schools that you're serious about, because often enough I hear a student won't even get out of the car if they don't like the place when they've driven up to it. I've heard it so many, many times. It's really a real thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's listening to your gut and saying, I got here and I thought I would love it, and I don't. Conversely, you get surprised about places that might get put on your list or suggested, and you're like, this is amazing. This isn't anything what I imagined. So you have to let yourself be open and really feel the place. You won't know until you step on the campus. And then once you're there, we are putting our best foot forward. We have students that we've trained and students who love our schools, so they're passionate about it. They're going to tell you honestly about things, but they're also all in love with it. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend hours giving tours all the time. So you want to go on the official tour, you want to talk with your admission counselor, but then you want to go off by yourself. And you want to walk in to the dining halls. You want to stop a student and talk to them, or you just want to see how students interact with each other and faculty members in our halls and on our campuses, and see if you can see yourself there. And that's how you'll be able to really get a sense of what that campus visit means. And worry less about the schools that are saying, is this demonstrated interest or not? You know, it's impossible, I think, for many of us to even know what that is anymore. Some schools will say that they still use it, but for many, it's much more about you can demonstrate interest by your application really knowing who we are, going back to mission, and being really clear about how that experience and how you see yourself at our institution. The visit can give you that edge in your application.
Yeah, and I would expand upon that to, you know, think about where you are in the cycle. The type of visit you do as a sophomore will be a very different type of visit that you're going to do later on as a senior or an admitted student. You know, as somebody who's just starting out the college search process, you're kind of kicking the tires, and what you're trying to get a sense for, to your point, I think, is, you know, what feels right. So, you know, you may not fly all over the country to go to the, you know, the schools that are at the top of your list, but if you want to know what a school of 5,000 students feels like, or a school in an urban environment versus a rural environment, you know, feels like, you can find those close by, and you can get on those campuses, and you can get a sense for, does this feel too big or too small or too rural? And then as you go through this process and you know, continue throughout high school and through the application process, that's where you'll get into much more detailed visits where you're sitting on classrooms, or where you're meeting with faculty, where you're eating in the dining halls. And to your question of should you do the visit, of course, the answer is yes. I mean, I really think that is that gut reaction that you get, that sort of visceral feeling that plays so much into this idea of fit. It's really about how a school makes you feel And it's hard to do that at those later stages without getting on campus. But early on, I think to your point, these virtual tours that we make available, these virtual information sessions that we have that are available, very early on, without having to be too intimidated, you can start to get your feet wet and start to feel what certain campuses are like without overly committing yourself or your family. And then as that list gets shorter and as your options become fewer and fewer, you can really do that deeper dive and really get into the visit.
Just real quickly, for the parents and caregivers, just so you know, my wife and I are veterans. We have one who's a college graduate a year and a half ago, gainfully employed, yay. And then our daughter's a junior right now in college. And we took both of our children to visit schools and so on. And it was really fascinating to watch sometimes how other caregivers and parents sort of behave during the tour or campus visit. So please be reminded it's for your child, not you. Right? You may want to move on from the word we, and telling us we like your school or we're going to apply, and really try not to take command of the tour just because my daughter and I saw this happen. This one parent was all over the tour guide, and slowly but surely, the students start backing up, and no longer interested in this school. So it's just one of those things, and not to say that you should not be interested, but let your child lead the process, right? It's for them, and our job is to be the best cheerleaders we can be.
I totally failed at that. Good. Great answers. Okay, let's move on to the application. We always hear how can a student stand out, especially if you don't interview anymore or you don't track interests, scores are optional. What can they do in terms of managing that? We do always hear, take the most rigorous program you can take that's offered at your school. But at NCHS with 28 APs and many college courses, that's impossible for our kids. But they're trying. We have kids trying to take 6 or 7 APs in a year, which doesn't help them to stand out, but they think it will. So just please, that was my editorializing, sorry. Please talk about how can they stand out?
This might be an unsatisfying answer, but I do think it's the truth. And just to preamble a little bit, does anybody know how many accredited bachelor's degree granting institutions there are in the United States? 4,000. Does anybody know how many applications a student can submit using the Common App? I bet the seniors in the room know. It's 20. So to save you from the math, that is 1/2 of 1%. The students are far more selective than even the most selective colleges in the country. And we know it. And seniors, you are probably regretting sharing your email address with the college board. Tip to the juniors if you haven't already, and sophomores, keep that in mind. And email inboxes are flooded. Physical mailboxes are being flooded because the colleges know that the students are more selective than they are. And if you can hang on, if you're applying to selective places, this can be a very challenging roller coaster. Because that's the world I live in, I'm less familiar. I think it's a challenging roller coaster no matter what. But from the selectivity standpoint, hang on to that. So now, with that in mind, how do you stand out? You do stand out. You do. And I think the whole point here is finding the good fits and just letting it go from there, owning the fact that you are incredibly selective, and tell your story. And so the best time you can spend to prepare for the candidacy, I would argue, is in introspection. It's figuring out, what do I love? What do I care about? What are places that speak to me and make my heart sing? And that might sound kind of squishy, but it's where you're going to live for 4 years. It's people who you may be in relationship with for the rest of your life. What makes your heart sing? And if your heart is singing about these schools you're applying to, and you're just being who you are and sharing what you love, what you care about, you will stand out. So I look at this from the other perspective. It's about that place that you're going to be a part of, and how do you help them see you for who you are and naturally see that fit with their school. I hope that makes sense.
I think we have to be very careful, too, of our own well-being in this process. And if you allow yourself the space to be your authentic self, which is the number one piece, and if you devote your energy in a constructive way to completing the application well, being introspective, having fun and enjoying what you're doing in high school, then you're going to be able to share that with us. And that's how we see your heart singing, right? So that's how we see it in the essay, because you wrote about something that was meaningful to you and showed us a glimpse of who you are. Or your letters of recommendation talk about your engagement in the classroom in such a way that we as admission officers can see you in our classrooms or in our halls. So the application is a series of opportunities, and you should use all of them. And if you walk away and say, I did the best that I could do with this application, this is who I am, and I am comfortable with that, then allow us to say, okay, I think you're going to thrive here with us, or maybe say, no, you're not going to thrive here with us. And those are okay. A rejection letter isn't a negative thing. It means it wasn't the right fit. So you could say, okay, that's fine. Who really wants me? Where am I going to thrive? And so that's where your focus should be, and that's finding this authentic fit between you and your gifts, and how we can make those gifts stronger and bring them out for you. And that comes from years of doing theater and dance admission, because when you're talking about the arts, that added a layer of this on there. Someone's craft could benefit from Fordham's theater program and not benefit from NYU's, because they have two different programs, right? So college admission writ large is not much different than that.
So this is what I told my own kids, you guys. You can stick out negatively, you can stick out positively, right? Because let's face it, we want to show these schools, and I'm speaking for my children, how perhaps they will contribute to these institutions and how they would be a good match, a good fit. And one of the things that we often talk about, and thank goodness my children went to a school like yours where they had really good counseling, right? And you guys are fortunate because you have 8 counselors here. My home state of California, the ratio is 800 to 1, if there is one, okay? So you guys have 8. So anyway, having said that, I told my own children, look, some schools engage in some kind of demonstrated interest, some don't, right? The national data bears out that about 1 out of 5 schools engage in some kind of demonstrated interest. And we all know what that is, right? And we know in the room, the purest form of demonstrated interest is early decision. So I make the argument, if a school tells you that they don't do DI, well, if you have ED, you kind of do, because it's the purest form. You told that school, if you admit me, I'll show up. So I told my own children, think about maybe the top 2 schools, top 3 schools on your list. And it wouldn't kill you to let the admission officer or counselor responsible for managing your school that you exist in, either attend a reception or write to that person and just introduce yourself. But when you do that, you can't just say, hi, I'm Grant, I'm Camden, I like your school. you might want to dig a little bit deeper and say, there's something about your arts program or something about your entrepreneurship program that really resonates with me, and here are some reasons why, blah, 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 blah. So you actually demonstrated that you dug a little bit deeper, that your interest is actually a little bit more than casual. So to me, that's one way to kind of stick out. A bad way to stick out is when you don't follow instructions, right? So when a school tells you they only want 2 recommendations, and all of a sudden we have 5, now we think you can't read instructions. And then some of these supplemental essays, read it carefully. When I was at Richmond, a lot of these schools have why essays. They supplement, why our school. So one year we did why spiders, right? Capitalized. You know how many essays we got about the arachnids? It was just amazing. People missed it. They missed it. It's not a typo. It's a big S. So, the quality of your application, to Paul's point, is really probably the most important thing. Pay attention to those instructions. And this is why, you want to take some time. You want to work with your counselors because they're the ones who are going to be helping you. They'll be guideposts for you throughout the process.
So it gets down to coming back to what students said, then I'm going to dig back to APs, extracurriculars. What does that list look like to show you that it's a good fit? We had a conversation at dinner about numbers of APs and data around that. So when you're looking at a transcript and then the activities, how much should they be doing? Because these kids are doing a lot. And I think they're missing the point of what you've all just talked about.
We're using a term called the ceiling effect, which students, you might not use that term, but you are living that. So many APs, so many extracurriculars, trying to fulfill what feel like so many requirements for really selective admissions processes. And the reality, I think, on our side is this, what we call the ceiling effect. So many applicants who are doing all of these things that go beyond what a student needs to do to be successful on our campus, or go beyond what a student needs to do to demonstrate that they'll be a positive contributor to our community. And it's just more and more and more. And I think the question is not the what as much as the why. And so, I mean, that's the thing that I worry about when we're talking about APs and other things, is that more is not necessarily better. There's a point of just, I think we get back to the why and what does this mean? And so there's that reality. And I think that the challenge then is in different, the way I think about this is different communities, success is defined in different ways. And I think so to be successful within your local context, whatever that means, you need to do that if you're aspiring to very selective places. But then beyond that, it's just too much frosting on the cake, so to speak. And meaning is more meaningful than more, if that makes sense. And Patricia was making that point about, what does it mean? And I think that's a question that people in our shoes are asking all the time. The what, fine, I've seen it. The why, that's your opportunity.
And there's the applicant's full of the what, right? There's so many students with so many APs who all have these very good GPAs. And so I think, and again, it goes back to doing the research, compiling a list, not based on what schools you want to tell people you apply to, but what schools are a good fit for you, and then aligning your strengths with those schools. And so do you need 7 APs or 8 APs? No, probably not, but you want to make sure that the coursework that you're challenging yourself in really matches the academic pursuits that you want to go into in college. I think that's where strength of curriculum does matter. If you want to be an engineer, I do want to see advanced coursework in math and science, but, I don't need to see a whole junior and senior year full of it. But I want to see that match. I want to see that fit, and then I want to read throughout your application, why you would be a good match with not only the institution, but your area of pursuit. And I think that can come through in a number of different ways, through activities, through the courses that you select, and through the leadership opportunities that you pursue.
I applaud secondary schools that are actually limiting AP courses by year. You can only take so many junior year, so many senior year. And in the end of the day, we only look at you all within the context, for instance, of New Canaan High School. So I know of high schools that have done that, and we respect that. We value that, because there's this thing called diminishing returns. And at some point, do you really need 12 APs? And in fact, there's actually data research out there that shows that after X number of APs, it's actually not helping the student. It's certainly not helping his or her, or, their mental health. So it's fascinating doing this for 3 decades, working at schools that have become more and more selective with stronger and stronger students. There's actually all of a sudden a correlation in sort of the increase of mental health issues with that student body. So colleges and universities have devoted a lot of resources for mental health and wellness now, because, we're frying our students. So I do actually ask schools sometimes, think about that, because in the end of the day, we look at you within the context of your school. So if there are only certain things that are afforded to you, or things are limited, then that's an okay thing too, right? That's good.
It's a wide range between a curriculum with very little challenge and a curriculum with challenge. And with challenge, it doesn't mean it has to be the most demanding thing at that high school. There's a range of demand that all of us will say is acceptable, is challenge, is pushing you. And there's no magic number, and there's no magic combination. I think to what you said about, if you're going into the business school, taking all these APs in the liberal arts is not going to make a business application stronger if there is no math, right? But a few math APs will, but not necessarily going crazy and having all of them. So there's gradations in the context of rigor. It's not something that's just the most rigorous and nothing else. But when you're talking about no challenge at all, that's where we're more absolute, right? That's where we're going to look a little bit more deeper, like why is there context for no challenge? Because we're worried that we will bring you into the classroom and you will not succeed. And that is the least desirable outcome for everyone in college admission.
Thank you. Applying early versus regular decision seems to have changed over the years a bit. More and more kids certainly are applying early, but more and more colleges, I think, are also advocating for that. Can you talk a little bit about applying early decision, early action versus regular decision? What do you think? Do they stand a chance in regular decision anymore?
The answer is it depends on the school. It depends on the school, the college. I worked at a place where if you applied regular decision, all of a sudden you're subjecting yourself to the biggest application plan, the biggest application pool within the context of that institution, because the school is selective and did not take all the qualified ED candidates, didn't take all of the qualified EA candidates, but did not deny. We didn't deny. We moved them to regular. All of a sudden, regular grew and grew and grew. So this is where you want to rely on your awesome counselors, because your counselors, do have some data available to them. They know how some schools behaved over time, but also, in the end of the day, I have to say, and this is what I told my own children, if you have a choice between applying early action and regular decision, it might be a good idea to apply early action, because, you might know early. Some schools might let you know before April 1st, for instance. So, early decision is a whole different animal. because you told that school that if admitted, you're going to show up. And the admit rates will vary from school to school around the country for ED, EA, and regular.
Yeah, the ED conversation is a completely different one, but I agree. I mean, if you, if you're trying to decide between applying early action, non-binding early notification, or regular decision, there's so many benefits to applying early as far as getting out in front of your college application process, getting a decision earlier, which enables you to make other plans if you need to. I would say that there is a certain type of student maybe where RD does make sense, a student who, perhaps is on an upward academic trend, or someone for whom that first semester of senior year would be meaningful because of the types of courses that they're in, kind of the type of student who, if they did apply early, is going to be deferred anyways. And that's where I think relying on your school counseling office is critically important, because they have that insight and they have that data that you spoke to. So, again, for the most part, it's, I think, better to get in early, but there are certain students where perhaps it is beneficial to apply regular decision. To your question, I think all of us do admit students regular decision. So, I mean, it's not as if you are,
It still exists.
Yeah, it still exists for a reason. But I do think earlier tends to be the trend that we are seeing as well. And I think can be beneficial for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think it's more important to apply to the right school regular than the wrong school early. And what I worry about in this part of a conversation is the students who are convinced they're going to apply early, they just haven't figured out where yet. And I think that's backwards thinking, and it's putting the transaction of admission, prioritizing that over the experience of college. And I think you can gather from my comments already tonight, I'm much more focused on the experience of college and the importance of that, primacy of that. And I wanted to make a point. It is always so interesting to hear other people talking about this, and I feel like I learned so much. And I think this point about admit rates, at least in the kind of, when I think about our peer schools like ours, people can see these wildly different admit rates and go, oh my gosh, it's so much easier to get in early. But you want to think about the early pool. I mean, as Gil said, it's a different ballgame. It's a different pool in early than it is in regular. In our case, coaches are recruiting athletes into early. That's what they like. And that's a pre-screened population that is well known, admitted at a higher rate than the applicant pool overall, significantly overrepresented in the early pool relative to the regular pool. So what's that going to do? That's going to lift the admit rate. You've heard me talk about the Dartmouth community. This is a passionate alumni population that we love and really engage with the students, and it's wonderful. And the children of Dartmouth alumni hear about Dartmouth, get to know Dartmouth, disproportionately are applying in the early round, something that I think is also well understood at private, highly selective institutions. The children of alumni tend to be admitted at a higher rate, and that's a whole nother conversation, but that population is overrepresented in early. Questbridge, increasingly at schools like mine, and if you're not familiar with Questbridge, it is a national scholarship program for low-income students in the United States. Schools like mine are admitting more and more Questbridge students. But different schools are counting Questbridge students in different ways. And to me, there's the irony of this is that it is the most selective way, it's the most selective pathway into a school like mine is through Questbridge. And again, totally different conversation. But how Questbridge candidates are counted matches an applicant. I mean, at least I can talk about my situation. So 90%, and I'm just throwing that out there, but the Questbridge population makes Dartmouth early look less selective than it is because of the way we're counting that population. So the point is we have three substantial portions in our early numbers that are making it look less selective than it actually is. So if you're not in one of those three categories, the selectivity that's reflected isn't telling you what you think it might be. And I'm speaking to my own experience. But I think that there is some generalizability of that concept to schools like mine. So again, I would say don't focus on the transaction aspects of this. Focus on the fit and what works. And if you have a first choice school, a clear first choice school, and you've done the calculators and you can see that it is a financially viable option, which is another thing that's happened in early, is that 10 years ago we didn't have those calculators. And so it's a much more socioeconomically diverse pool than it used to be. If all that lines up, great. It's an amazing convenience and how nice to be done with this process early. But if not, that's what you have regular decision for. And that's still a huge chunk of students coming in.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the essay part of the application. Could you talk a little bit about any advice you'd have for crafting an essay or common mistakes you see that students make, and perhaps some of the best that you've read?
So first, I'll start with an example, and then we'll talk about what that means. So I said that I did arts admission for a number of years, and I did dance admission for a number of years. But this example, I think, fits many well-worn essay topics. So many dancers, their first experience of ballet is the Nutcracker. And so it's a seminal experience, and it's early on. And so I've read thousands of Nutcracker essays, thousands of Sugar Plum Fairies, thousands of Mouse Kings, thousands of them. And then I read this one. And this young man said, I was elected to be the prince, and I was so excited. And it was the most stressful period in my life because I was experiencing growth spurts. And my the leader of the troupe had said, if I grew any more, I would not fit in the costume, and I would lose my opportunity to be the prince. And it was this reflection about something that was out of his control, but related to him being a dancer, and it was the best Nutcracker essay ever, right? There were no Sugar Plum Fairies in this essay. But that is my first kind of start. So you will all have lots of shared experiences that you're doing together that you may gravitate to that will sound very similar to all of us. You must find your authentic way into those different experiences. So if you're an athlete, the big game essay can't be about the big game. It has to be about a learning. It has to be about something that you experienced individually. If you're doing a service trip, it can't be about what you're seeing in that trip, but what you learned about yourself from that trip and how it changed you. So well-worn essays are fine. You know, we've read thousands of Catcher in the Rye. Holden speaks to all of us at this age. You know, Hamlet speaks, procrastination speaks to us at every age, right? But it's always these essays that talk about the person in a really unique way. That's where you need to spend that time. You have to answer the question. You have to be grammatically correct. You have to show and not tell, all of those things that are very basic. But if you really want to win us, it's just letting yourself shine through and making sure, like a mirror, if you're not seeing yourself come back in that essay all the time, then that's not the essay you should be submitting to us.
And that's the number one mistake that I see is students who write an essay very clearly through the lens of what they think we want to know or what they think we want to hear, and you lose that authenticity. And to your point, the topic, we probably all have a different favorite essay, and frankly, it's different for every member on the staff. And so you can't try to guess what we want to hear. The only thing you can do is be true to yourself and let that authenticity stand out. And you can't do that if you're trying to picture us reading it in the admissions committee. It really has to be something that's authentic and it's in your voice. And that's the number one mistake I see.
Well said. Let's jump to standardized tests because I think that was a lot of questions that parents or students wrote in and had questions about. You get a lot of applications. It seems to be rising, how many applications you get. What did we say, over 80% are score optional in the country at this point?
Yeah, so, you want me to just quickly show that tell them the number?
Sure.
So, out of the 4,000 colleges, universities in our country, a little over 2,400 actually grant bachelor's degrees. And of the 2,400 plus, 82% are either test optional or test blind. That's a lot.
That is. So how has that changed admissions for you? Can you talk about the discussions and trends for standardized testing? Will we be returning to testing? What are you thinking? Magic ball here?
We adopted a permanent test optional policy a year ago. And the reason behind that is we have enough data, and data is gonna be subject to institution. And we ran, even in my past institution, we ran data, and at least at these two institutions, there's really not much of a difference between those who submitted and those who did not submit it in terms of their first year or even first semester or even first year academic performance. It was such a slight little difference, right, for those who submitted test scores that were slightly above, but really nothing significant. So for the institutions that I served, when we decided to go test optional, it did not matter. But again, it's up to the data and how these other schools are looking at it, because in the end, we're interested in your success on our campuses. So it's going to vary, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I also would take the opportunity to state that, the role of standardized testing, even prior to schools moving to test optional, I think was a bit overstated in many cases. I mean, it was always, a data point that we would use, but it was always a secondary data point in the evaluation process, I think, for most of us. And I think that students often overemphasized standardized testing in the first place. Obviously, now that many schools are 80% or test optional, it carries even less weight. We're in the middle of a 6-year pilot, and it is going to be the data that drives that decision making. And where we're at now is, we can see the GPA data, and it's relatively even. We can see first and second year retention. I think where we're still waiting to see it play out is with 4- and 6-year graduation rates. And so, I feel fortunate that, we have the faculty at UVM coming to us kind of to demand that we make it permanent. And I don't know if that's always the case. I think oftentimes many faculty want these standardized tests to be part of the process. So if I had a crystal ball for the University of Vermont, I think it's going to be very difficult to go back to requiring testing. But if the data plays out in such a way where it is a meaningful predictor for graduation and performance, then I think, that would change the calculus. But, it's always been something that was in our tool chest, but nothing that we overemphasize in the process.
Very similar for Fordham, and we've extended through the class of 2025, so juniors in the room were test optional officially through 2025. Same thing, we're looking at data. I would add for us, the COVID years have made the data more complex, so we don't really want to analyze that data knowing that there are other factors at play that could also be contributing to different variances that we're seeing. So we really want to have more time with that data. I'm hoping we don't go back, because I love the way that we review now in this way. And I think what I would add is the question that we get is, should I submit my testing? And my answer to students is the testing an accurate reflection of what you want us to see? If the answer is no, then I think the answer is easy, that you shouldn't submit the testing, right? So if it's not, that's not who you are in the classroom, and it's really giving a negative drag to that, we're not asking to see that. Conversely, though, if you have exceptionally high scores and your classroom performance is very low, that will still not work as well for all of us, okay? So test optional did not change that. So look at and remember, our middle 50%, all of us are now inflated because the higher the scores are the ones that are being sent in. So it just makes that part of the equation a little bit more difficult, because we're seeing, you're looking at the middle 50% for 35% of the class.
I have a lot of echoing this. Everybody's looking at their own data, and which is what we should be doing. I think Gil's point about this is going to vary, and I think most of you were saying that same thing. And Patricia, your point about transcript's the king. Always has been, always will be. I think it's important to look at the language that schools have on their websites about this. And schools, their rationale, why are they test optional? Why did they go test optional? Will tell you something about the philosophy behind the decision. And in our case, we paused our testing requirement because of the pandemic. And so it was a pause in a policy, not a change in a policy. And this year, if you look at schools' language, you can get an indication of how they feel about their test policy based on what they're saying. So the words that they're using when they talk about testing on their website is very deliberate to try and communicate, again, the philosophy. And in our case, we are recommending that students submit scores. And to that, and I think you were asking that question, so when should you submit scores? For us, it's you should submit scores. We're recommending it.
Okay, there you go.
Like, duh.
Well, and we always ask, because we're New Canaan, we're a highly, wealthy community, well-supported students, do you expect higher scores, that we would send scores, or wonder if a student doesn't send scores? Versus, pandemic-related schools that aren't as well-resourced as ours.
Yeah. I mean, again, I want to repeat the importance of the transcript. But we find, and historically, we have a lot of data on this going back a long way, that our ability to predict a student's first-year academic performance improves when we have a student's test score, along with their transcript. So the more academic data points that we can put into that consideration, the better we get at predicting things. And we like getting our own version of A's. We like predicting well. And so what is success? Like, not everybody who graduates from our institution needs to graduate with a 4.0, and we get it. So the threshold for success on our campus is a different thing than our ability to our interest in predicting success on our campus. And so we are well aware of variations in testing patterns, and that the strongest correlate, my understanding of this, and I haven't looked in the data, and some of you may have looked at this more recently than me, but my understanding is the strongest correlate for how a student will perform on a College Board exam is how much money their parents make. And we get that. But that's, again, more is not necessarily better in this case. It's what's that whole story, and how does it all fit in? And the test score is one feature among many. And as much as we can emphasize, it's not the most important thing. Transcript's the most important thing. Does it matter? Sure, it matters. Everything matters. Are we going to admit some students with lower scores? Yes. And it was interesting to hear your point about current testing data, and I really appreciate what Patricia's saying about be wary of data. And we're so wary of it, we haven't posted our data since the class that enrolled before COVID started. Mm. So we're not even showing our data because of exactly what you're saying. But if you take that, the mid 50% mark, and I think this is really important as schools are talking about this, people who are above the 75th percentile, and that assumption we're from a wealthier community, all our students should be up there. So the first misnomer there is that if you're up there, you're in SAT nirvana, And if you're up there, you know what Nuvrana means. And you think we're good. But schools that are in that most selective category are denying 2/3 of those applicants, at least at this point, 2/3 of those applicants. So that isn't necessarily going to provide the lift that you think it might. And then students in the bottom quarter, that's 25% of the entering class. In our case, that's 250 or so students. That's a lot of students. And some of them are coming from communities like this one, because the other aspects of their candidacies are winning the day. And we know that those students are prepared to be successful on our campus. And so we see a score, we move past a score, because the other aspects of the candidacy do build a compelling case. So it's about predicting success, and the bar for that isn't as high as I think people fear.
Be nice to your counselor students, because they'll give you good guidance. And my children, especially with my daughter, it was during the pandemic, and 2 SAT administrations that she signed up for got canceled while she was already there, and was not able to take SATs. And finally, she was able to take one of them, and she scored very well. She's smart like her mom. And, in the end of the day, she got good guidance, because some of the schools on our list, that really good score, even though it was in the top 7% for her cohort, it would just put her in the middle 50%. And, well, it's almost like, well, should you or should you not? And whereas some of the schools on their list, it put her in the, in the very sort of tippy top. So it's just one of those things that you just have to, consult with your counselors and ask them for their guidance on some of these things. Because again, some schools still are in love with test scores. Some schools are not as in love with them. And when I say in love, it's not to be disrespectful, but it's the idea that for their institutions, it's still a very good predictor of that academic success that we're looking for, right, from school to school. And I worked at a school where, like to Paul's point, everyone had, this is in the early 90s when I had beautiful black hair, it was down to here, everyone had, this was a big deal back then, everyone had a 1470. We didn't even care about test scores at that school. We cared about your essay, we cared about your writing, because at that school, and the irony is, it was a math and science school, because writing was a big deal for us in terms of your success. It wasn't the test score anymore.
Okay, new topic. Let's talk about financial aid. Will that change how, if someone says they are going to be applying for financial aid, will that change how you look at an application?
Depends on the school. If the school is need blind,
What does that mean? Could
need
you?
blind means that the admission office is siloed in its decision review and does not consider whether or not you want aid or not. Need aware means that we take into consideration whether or not we can sufficiently fund you. So there's need aware and need blind. So that's another website thing, or question, or talking to your counselor. Is it need blind or need aware? If you don't have need, neither one of those are probably going to make a difference. But for families where need is important, those types of considerations are going to be much more important. And that's also where the ED conversation comes in. Because ED means you're committed to go, and what financial aid package we give you is what has to be sufficient. You can be released if it's not sufficient, but that's not a process you want to engage in. It's a long and torturous appeal process, and it's not what you want to do. So you want to just be careful about those two pieces. You also want to think about, most of us give some form of aid. Some of us are more resourced in terms of our financial aid budgets, and so we can aid more than others. So using the net price calculators will help you determine, is this within reach or not? It doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, because sometimes we can surprise even the net price calculator, because something about The applicant means you're eligible for this like scholarship that we're looking for this one person for. So it's just
Because you're talking
important.
about merit aid.
Merit aid, there's
Right.
need, merit, there's all the combinations. I should have broken that out. It's complicated, but I think, try to, if you have the conversations as a family, that you're applying to wherever you want to apply to, but we may not be able to afford everything, and are we okay with that? Then you let things happen and you let us see what we can do. But if you don't have those conversations, that's the hard thing. When the dream school comes through with the admission piece, but then doesn't come through with the financial aid.
Yeah, I really appreciated your answer. And the thing I was thinking about is, so what do we do with that information as need-blind schools? And the admissions process isn't any different, but the financial aid process may be different, because the schools are using that marker and they're transiting that. I like that word, siloed. That's like the one thing that goes over the silo wall, is this is a candidate who's applying for financial aid. And so a student may receive communication from a financial aid office because they've checked off yes to make sure that their financial aid documentation has all been submitted. So you get an incomplete notice from the financial aid office because they want to get your material in. And so the admissions ignores that indicator, but financial aid uses it for their process.
Good point.
Yeah, I worked at 3 of the 5 institutions I served were need aware to an extent, and that's when I say to an extent, that's when we know we really have tapped into our financial aid budget. And then at some point, all of a sudden, at these institutions were asking the question now, what percentage or what can you pay towards the cost of attendance? And it's just simple economics, because some institutions are very, very wealthy, they have a lot of resources. And I used to work at that 0.5% where at that one institution we're need blind and we met 100% of need. So, but the 3 institutions, the other ones I served, one of them, you could be the tippy top student. If you need $1, the most I can give you is 81 cents. We actually gapped at that one institution because we did not have enough, of our own resources to meet 100% of your demonstrated need. And this is why, again, everyone, you want to do your research. You want to find out, what's available from school to school. I gave my son a spreadsheet, and we had that talk. This is what mom and dad can afford, right? And if you're going to look at certain schools, then heads up, we either have to qualify for aid or you have to, earn some kind of merit scholarship, if you're thinking about some of these schools. So it's just one of those things that, to Patty's point, you have to talk about, finances in this process. And then to what you just said, oh my gosh, never wait till the last minute.
Yeah, that's the sad moment, when you get accepted and you as a parent said, I can't afford to send you. So yes, have those conversations very early. Perhaps we can talk about some recent trends happening this year. Supreme Court came down with decisions around affirmative action. AI is playing it's becoming important in admissions, but let's start with the Supreme Court and the new decisions around affirmative action. Will that change how you're doing things in your institutions?
Yeah, yes, it very much changes what we're doing in
Oh,
our
it is.
process. Fundamentally, operationally, it's data that we're still permitted to collect, but it can't be used in any way in the selection process. So we have to gate it from the application review process and from all of our readers. And so that just on a very basic level changes, the dynamic of the process. But what I would say is that the way in which that information was used in the past, certainly at the University of Vermont, and I think probably at most schools, it was never sort of a check the box sort of data point. I think, Paul, you alluded to it earlier. What we're trying to create ultimately is the best educational environment where students will find the most success, and that's impossible to do unless you have students who come from different backgrounds, who have had different experiences, and therefore bring different perspectives to the academy. And so it was always used in that way, and it was multifaceted and nuanced, and it had a hell of a lot to do more than just race and ethnicity. And so what we're forced to now do is to try to identify those perspectives and those experiences through other means, whether that be lived experiences that the student talks about in an essay, or other information we can glean from activities or a recommendation. And I think it's going to really vary depending on the school and where it is in the country, and frankly, how risk adverse their general counsel is. I think that, but again, there's nothing that the Supreme Court has done that changes our institutional priorities, our common ground, the things that we aspire to, and those goals that we continue to have, which is to create the best educational environment.
Pretty well
That was
said.
good.
Yeah.
That was it.
Sold.
Yeah.
There,
Go ahead.
sorry. So, what I'm afraid of is that this is just sort of the beginning, and there'll be other things now that will come into play that all of a sudden colleges, universities, all of a sudden must account for, or, we just can't do anymore. So I'm afraid it's just the beginning. I think, at some point, financial aid and scholarships will come into, question. And who knows, maybe the legacy piece will come into question, because in the last couple of years, you've heard announcements that more and more of these colleges and universities are, quote, doing away with legacy admission. So it's just fascinating how, this is just all happening right before our eyes, where the federal government has taken more and more of an interest in how colleges, are running ourselves. So, we'll see what happens, guys. Our jobs are hard enough as it is. It just complicates it a little bit more now, too.
Right. Okay, I think we're going to open it up to questions. Final question for you before we move on is, what advice would you give to the parents about what their role is in this process?
So your role is the navigation role. There's drivers and there's navigators. Navigator. And there's a lot that you can do to allow your students to really enjoy their high school experience. And so that's directing them back to center when they're going too far off center, deep into the process, or deep in worrying, or doing things for the sake of the college application that has nothing to do with them developing and growing and becoming who they are. So that's your role. And keeping the calendar. There is no problem with you saying the SAT is next Saturday. Did you remember that and set your alarm clock? Or the FAFSA is going to be opening December this year. Make sure I have that on my calendar to fill out the FAFSA. So those types of things are really, really helpful if you can just be in the background, making sure that they're not missing out and also just not missing things.
And I would add, figure out the way in which you want to communicate about these various things. I've seen families just at each other's throats, and I think that there are times where a student wants you to ask about this process, and there's other times where they don't. And I think it's just a process of communication. I think you have to kind of work through, and I think you do that by being intentional about it. Whether that is on a particular schedule or, with a certain understanding around the sort of cycle of the college search and application process. But be intentional about how you communicate, about what you can afford, about where you feel like you can visit, about what the schedule in which you can engage this process. I think having that open dialogue and really being intentional about how you communicate will make your lives a lot easier. It won't save you from all the headaches, but it'll help you avoid some of them.
Yeah. So, Gail, I'm thinking about this because I have two kids similarly aged, and to Moses' specific point about schedule, we picked one. It was Sunday afternoon. That's when we could talk about college. Did you do that with your kids?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had to do that.
Yeah, and I found that to be so helpful because as parents, we have ideas and we go, oh, let me share this idea with you. And then I realized an idea would come and go if I waited until Sunday. And if I forgot, it must not have been that important. And if it was that important, I would write it down to remember for Sunday.
That's it.
Because they're having their lives and they're having all their stressors in the day-to-day. And if I'm interrupting them every time I think of something, that's not helpful. So anyway, it was kind of the danger zone, and sometimes the kid kind of slinks in and like, all right, now it's time to talk about college, but at least it's contained to that one time. So I really appreciate that point. But actually, I have 4 words for the parents. It will be okay. It will be okay. You have done a great job. And think about the life that you have created for your children. Think about the community in which you've raised them. They are so well prepared for this because of the work you have done. And I think as parents, we need to be confident in that. And I think this is very hard as a parent because when you applied to college, for those of you who went to college, it was a totally different universe. And so much of our time as parents has been, oh, I know how to do this. You put one foot in front of the other. You lift the lid. Whatever that is, you've done it. And so you know. But now you're in a situation where you don't know. The pressures on our children are so different from the pressures that we had. And the college admissions environment is in a different solar system. It's not even a different planet. It's in a different solar system. So how do we guide our children? And we as parents, need to be confident in what we have built for them and the resources at their disposal, the strengths that they've developed, that you've seen them develop over time. They've got this, and they are going to be okay. And if you can own that, they will see that in you, and that will help them with their own confidence in their selectivity and their choices. So I think as parents, we need to know and own that it will be okay.
Oh, you guys took all the good ones. So I'll give you a couple of, just fair warnings, right? So parents, if your child ends up going to a, quote, second-tier school, does that mean they're a second-tier individual? Of course not, right? Sometimes disappointing things will happen. Well, why do we want to add, to their anxiety? Why do we want to sit there and all of a sudden they're upset and now all of a sudden you're going to be all upset because you personally wanted X to happen? That's really not helpful, right? Because again, it's about them, not us. So the one analogy I love, you guys, is, when they started playing soccer, organized soccer, right? They're the players, right? You got coaches, right? You got referees, which would be us, right? And again, what is your role? Cheerleaders, right? Get those orange wedges ready to go. Give them hugs when it's time to give them hugs. Celebrate those small little accomplishments because they blocked the kick, right? Or they blocked the goal, or they stopped picking dirt and actually engage in the game. So those are the things. And honestly, if your student is organized and they work with their counselors, it's going to be a lot better for everyone. It's really that piece of doing your research and staying on top of things. And that's what, to Patty's point, that is where you can be really helpful. And not to stereotype or generalize too much, we helped our son a little bit more than our daughter. I gave my son
They always do.
I gave my son a spreadsheet. It was covered by the New York Times because, I needed him to be a little bit more organized. Whereas my daughter's like, I don't want that spreadsheet. I have a notebook, Dad. So again, your children better. Ask them how you can help them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really thoughtful answers. Questions from people here? Anyone have any questions? We're tired. Way over there.
What do you think about the concept of a senior school? Does that still exist?
The question was, what's the What do you think about the concept of a safety school? Does it exist?
Safety in terms of, okay, so not literally a school that is more safe. I just think the terminology is important. So a less selective school, I think that's a great place to start the college search. Because from my perspective on this, there are so many amazing schools. I think about this. I was thinking about this when Patricia was talking about the kind of global nature of the campus at Fordham, and American higher education is the envy of the world, and so those less selective options, lock that up, figure that out. What less selective school is going to make my heart sing? If you know that, great. And I do think that there is, and we didn't get to talk about this at dinner, but the question I would have wanted to ask about, because I feel like I'm observing this anecdotally, students opting out of the most selective schools, saying, I don't need that selectivity. I can find what I want here. And if it's that kind of crazy selective place, what are those students going to be like on that campus? I don't want to go to school with them. And that's totally fine. So that's what I think about safety schools.
And could I add, it's the heart singing part. So we're in this kind of application boom because so many applications are meaningless. If you have no heart, intention, will, desire to go to a place, don't put an application in there, because it only makes it harder for us. The students who really wanted that spot may not get it. And that's how this has all kind of gotten out of control. The ease of the common application means I can put in 20, but I only really like 8 of them. So why did you put in all of those others? It cost you all money, right? So it's being intentional.
Yeah, don't be an admission letter, collector. I mean, seriously, right? So I tell people all the time, if deep down in your heart that if offered admission, you would not attend that school, why? Why are you going to apply to that school? But that said, having a foundational school, I think is the lingo I've heard, recently, that, instead of a safety school, it's your foundation school, to what Paul's talking about, where you might want to start. You want those too, because you want a balanced list. And your counselors will tell you, you want your schools that maybe you're really aiming for because their profile is here, and maybe you're just a little below that, but then you have your middle ones where you're right smack in the middle of that profile, and then you have these schools where your profile is above theirs or just above average, above the middle band of it, but the common spine is that you're going to be happy at these schools, and they're going to meet your needs academically and socially, because frankly, we own this to be true. All these CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, not all of them went to the most selective of schools, right? It's what you do once you're there. And you might want to ask the question, what do students do after graduation from these institutions? Because outcomes, right, is actually really important. You'll be surprised, parents, to know how all these colleges have, quote, upped their game since you went to college. Right? Some of these schools that was a safety school 10 years ago is really not a safety school anymore.
It's always a surprise. Go ahead.
How many applications do each of you go look over in a season? How long do you spend on each student's application? And if you make a decision, is it seen by someone else at your school, or are you the sole decision maker?
I have to take this one because I love this question.
Okay.
I love it in a complex way. I want to start with how much time we spend on an application and just turn that on its head. So all of us collectively, maybe it's 100 years here of reading applications all together. If we're spending more than a few minutes on an application, something's not sitting in that application that makes sense for us. So you actually don't want us poring over something for a long, long time, because that means we're trying to figure out what makes sense, and if if there's a hole or something missing or an explanation, this is professionals. You know, it's kind of like being a race car driver. We know how to do this quickly. So it's not about speed, it's about accuracy. And so some of us will have one reader, some of us will have committee-based, which means 2 of us are reading. Others will have a reader for some and then a committee for others because there's special programs. It's going to vary. But I don't want you to really worry, are we spending hours on them? The longer we spend, the more I'm thinking something might not make sense, and then we have to dig in deeper. If everything's coming together, we're zipping through and we're thrilled and we're excited and we see the student like, you know, on opening day and we're moving them along in the process. But it might be different for others.
No, I think that's a great point. Some candidacies are going to move faster through the process than others, and for different reasons. And I think the care that we invest in building our communities, I mean, that's the value of holistic admission, is being, and they're terribly inefficient processes at our schools, because that's what enables us to develop the kinds of communities on campus. So.
I think the other part that you might want to think about with that question is how self-selecting that pool is. Because you can have a pool of 100,000, but if all of a sudden just 10,000 are really academically qualified, well, that tells you something, right? But if all of a sudden an institution, you know, well over 80% or 85 or 90% and so on are some of the best students in the United States and abroad, now you're dealing with a super concentrated pool where all of a sudden, well, who really cares now in terms of, you know, volume? It's really about how strong and diverse that pool is, because that's really a big question, you know. So to me, I worked at places where we had an admit rate of, you know, 40%, you know, we had an admit rate of 20%. It just, to me, it just depends on that pool and the things that we're trying to accomplish from school to school.
But with 10,000 applications or 20, are there filters to where you won't even get to read the essay because the GPA doesn't fit or the whatever? I think that's what we worry about, is that you're not even gonna get, the computer's gonna say denied right before you get there.
The computer.
There's
no,
very
there's
few,
no-
there are very few schools that are like that, and maybe, I don't know if you can speak to some of the bigger publics that might have that, but we get 43,000, we read 43,000. I can promise you, because there's people right now who are home reading the 43,000. There are no cuts for a place like Fordham, because Fordham also has programs for students who are non-admissible. We have a higher education opportunity program for New York State students. So we can't use a GPA cut. We need to see if we can get those students into that opportunity program. So we have to read every application. It also would just feel wrong if we didn't, but that's who we are. And the only time that I think AI could be really interesting is if they could help us with some of those complicated things that have nothing to do with the read, but have to do with the processing.
Yeah. I've never worked for a place that didn't read essays or recommendations.
Oh, is it sound on the larger side?
Yeah, I mean, we're the same. We're going to read everything. I can't speak to, you know, the schools that are receiving 6-figure application volumes. I don't know. You know, many of those aren't very selective. So if little to no time is being spent, it's most likely on auto admits versus auto denies, and then the schools are going to spend a lot of time in the middle and the bottom. But I can't think of a school where I've heard, not that they would be shouting it from the rooftop, but where they're just kind of spitting out denies without looking at anything.
But the other thing I think about with this is, and the point's been made a number of times, a community that invests in a strong counseling staff, like here, I think that question is this an appropriate school? And just because you're talking about academic thresholds, you have seasoned professionals who are going to help with that and kind of say, this is really a reach, or this is a better target. And that having a range of those makes a lot of sense. I think it's all about building the list. And those places that are great, that as a student, I love those places of varied selectivity. That's that's the sweet spot.
I have a friend who works at a place that, they get well over 100,000 applications every year, and they hire, staff, many of them from the high school end to actually read applications. They go through training. So, I don't know if there's too many places where, literally in the end of the day, no one really, it's just random. I don't see that to be the case, because again, we all have our own missions. We have institutional priorities. So that tells you between those two things, we have to actually hunt and look for the kind of students that we want on our respective campuses.
In the back there?
How much do you consider whether the student, if admitted, would attend the school? And asking that question in the context of seeing recent trends, I have an older student who's a college student now, where she and many of her classmates were deferred from schools that, by their scores alone and activities and whatnot, should have been admitted, should have been in quotes, but were deferred until they either demonstrated interest by changing their status to an early decision application, or demonstrated interest in some other way to make it clear to the university that they would attend. So how does that factor into your admission process?
Yeah, there are schools that do that all the time. I mean, there's schools where that denied you, early action, and then a week later tell you, well, if you would consider ED, we'll consider or strongly consider your application. There are schools that do that, and frankly, it's their prerogative. And it muddies the waters a little bit for a lot of families because, wow, I got denied last week, and now they want me to apply ED.
Yeah, I think, I think to Paul's point, the world of admission has changed dramatically, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think where you can see decisions that maybe don't make sense on the surface is when we're kind of in the middle of our pool trying to meet institutional priorities. So you could have the activities and the scores and the grades, but in a competitive environment where you have more capable students than you have room for, you're going to have students that look fine that don't get accepted. And I think what's shifted for many of us over the last 10 years is where that middle is. Students that would have been shoo-ins 10 years ago now find themselves in that middle where it's about more than just, what information they're presenting. It's about how they fit within the institutional priorities. And that's, when I field, phone calls from people who are kind of surprised about a decision, I think they don't quite understand where they fall within the overall applicant pool. And once you're in that middle, anything can really happen. And to some regards, it's outside of your control because we're trying to shape our class and meet institutional priorities.
Oh, you got one over there?
With all this talk about trying to shape it and getting varied and everything, do you look at a school like Canaan High School and say, this is a kid that we have enough of these, we don't want these kids?
Yeah, that's why we're here tonight.
Hey, I got up at 3:45 this morning, to fly out here.
That is, I will give you, that is a common question, this idea of is there a quota? That I often hear that.
It takes so many from our school.
Yeah, and so, I think, I would only speak for UVM, but you're going to take any competitive applicant who meets institutional priorities, regardless of how many other competitive students you've admitted who meet institutional priorities. So there's not a quota that we work under that limits how many students we might admit from a specific school.
Yeah. We're here. Had a nice meal too, thank you.
You're welcome. One last question over there.
During the discussion, you emphasized, you put the emphasis on the essays, how authentic, sounds of the student. But we know that it could have been written by higher help. And in today's day and age, it could have been written by AI. So how do you detect such cases
So I think those are two good things to put together. Hired essay help and AI, because I think people are not making the connection that we've dealt with the former for decades. The latter is just a different version of that. It's some other entity changing the voice of the student who's writing. And when the voice doesn't connect with the rest of the application, like the alarm bells start to go off. So that's the thing you don't want to have happen, right? Like, why does this not fit with everything else? I don't think AI is going to, I mean, the jury's out, right? We have to know it's out there. I tell students use it for brainstorming, but the same way I would say, the minute somebody else other than you puts a word on the paper that's not your word, it's not your essay anymore. And so we're looking to hear the voice, right? We want to hear that voice in there. And if it's not the student's voice, it's not going to be a value add. And the more selective, and I'll defer to Paul on this, the more selective you are, when those essays are not fine-tuned that way, they fall flat. You're not in it.
So
I didn't mean to put you on the
Oh,
spot.
no. No, it's, I'm remembering a science teacher in 8th grade who said, if you cheat on this exam, you are only cheating yourself. And I thought, yeah, right. But she was right. And so I would frame it in the opposite way that you framed it. I think the student who is outsourcing their essays to hired help or to a computer device is at a disadvantage. Because I don't think the goal is to get in. And I realize tonight is a lot about how do I educate myself about this process to maximize my opportunities or my experience. And we think about this in transactional terms. So I don't think the goal is to get into school. I think the goal is to have a great college experience that will be a foundation for the rest of somebody's life. And I think it's worth kind of reflecting on how do I want to live my life? And I realize this is really abstract and kind of high end, but seriously, life is right now. And what kind of choices are you going to make for yourself in your life? Are you going to take the really important things and get somebody else to do them? Or are you going to do them yourself? And so that's one. Two, I think the disadvantage part is to wind up at the wrong school. And you want to wind up at the right school. And so if you want that school to know you for who you are, and you might not get all the decisions that you want out of that process, but you'll get the best decisions you can for you. And if you've hit the sweet spot on picking the schools and different selectivities, it will be okay. And so I think clouding the message, and one thing to remember about these highly selective, holistic places, a candidacy will be 30 to 40 pages in length by the time it's done, sometimes more. Because we have the students writing, we have the rest of their common application, we have 2 teachers who write on behalf of the student, we have a college counselor who write on behalf of the student. A lot of places have interviews, many places have supplemental recommendations, and people will have this special talent stuff and things that they're writing about. That's a lot of stuff. And so to Patricia's point about something seeming off, when we have that many data points, I would argue it is very, very hard to control all of those variables in an intentional way. And, so the authentic voice actually, I think, serves the student better in the long run.
In the end, it's an ethical issue, right? So you have to go ahead and make a choice, but you're also potentially running a risk. If all of a sudden, let's say, you did AI and it comes across as wooden, and maybe it might pass through the lens of one admission office, or maybe you actually, it's just running a risk because some schools might guess that, oh my gosh, maybe this is not your work. So it's just one of those things that why take a risk? And it's kind of hard sometimes to get that genuine voice that you're talking about, Patty. I've seen an AI written essay, even though it is actually well-structured, you know, it does come across as a little wooden a little bit. So it's just one of those risks that do you really want to take?
Well, thank you, all of you. It's been wonderful to have you tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's been very good.
Have fun, you guys.